This video is going to be about walking through a sample problem. So someone who commented on one of my other videos told me that they're trying to calculate the rainfall index based on a set of data. They emailed me over that data. So in this video, we will be first looking at the data, trying to understand what is the problem, what is it that we have, what are we trying to find, and then how are we going to go about calculating. So we'll go through those steps together. And this data is a little bit different than some of the other data I've been working with. It's a text file and it's a little bit trickier. So we have to think about how we're going to parse that data out. And that's some of the stuff we'll talk about first. And then we'll go into doing actual calculations once we get that data parsed out. I want to start off by saying thank you, Siri Gary, for your comment and this problem and the data set. And I'm just going to go ahead and dive in and open up the data and check out what we're working with. I am unfamiliar with this data, so we'll be going through this together and I will talk through how I'm approaching looking at this data and parsing it out. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is go ahead and just read this file in. So I'm going to run this, read it in, and look at the data that I'm working with. So I can already tell from this text file, it's going to be a little frustrating to parse into the data. That's the first thing that I have to do. And one of the first things I'm seeing right away is these big headers separating everything. So I have this as a separation point. So I want to go ahead and start with that. All right, so I'm just putting sep for separation. It's a good idea when you're naming your variables that you pick things that make sense to you. I'm pretty sure in a week, if I look at this, that's not going to mean anything to me. So it'd probably be better to put something a little more clear. Maybe I'll just put header on it and that would be enough for me to remember what it is. So I want to use this to figure out where are all those separations happening. And since I've already read the file and I'm going to go ahead and suppress that. So let's say breakpoints. Going to happen whenever I'm finding this separation headers point. So this is all ones and zeros. If I want to change that, I can do find. And now I have numbers. So these are the row numbers of where this is happening. So when I look at these row numbers, I can see a pattern pretty quickly that there's 2 points away, 2 different headers. So look here, I know there's a bunch of data between these because it's more, and this is one of my headers. So let's look at that data set again. So I want to look towards the bottom. So I see total records. That part I kind of just want to ignore at this point. I really want to get this rainfall data here. So, oh, I saw one. There we go. So right here, I have one of those headers, and then I have a location and different information, and then I have another one of those headers. So when I have 2 of those headers happening in a row with information in between, then I know that that information in between is going to give me a location, and then after it's going to be data. So I want to separate all of those different parts out. There's a bunch of different ways I could do this just for the purpose of getting through this. I'm going to go ahead and do a for loop just to parse through these different points and get my headers and my data separate. And now again, I already know that the very end of this data, okay, so I know at the very end of the data I have that total, and I see at the beginning I have up to row 9. Row 9 is where I really am starting the data I'm working with. 1 through 8 is more descriptions. So I'm going to get rid of 1 through 8 and I'm going to get rid of the very end, and that way it's not confusing that common pattern that I'm seeing of the location data between these 2 points. Data. I could slice here and say the specific places I'm looking, or I can just assign it to data and then I can go ahead and use diminution to get rid of the ones I don't want. So 1 through 8. And let's see how far I can, and then just the last 2. 8 and now that's going to say slice out those areas, and this says delete them. So go ahead and not run it yet because I have an incomplete for loop. For loop's not doing anything yet, but I can still run it to make sure that my data looks good. So again, this is my full data set, and then this is my data no header. So I do see it starting right where I wanted to start with the first location. And the last one has total records still because I did data. No header has data. So I've gotten rid of the total records at the end of data no header. So again, I'm looking for this new pattern. So I want to go ahead and use breakpoints here instead of above. So I want to make sure it's on data no header because again, I don't want to have all of those different beginning parts and I don't want all of my lines to be off. If I were using the original one I found, well, nothing would match up anymore because I deleted the first 8 rows. Also, I've noticed that there's 2 headers per every location, so I want to divide that by 2 because I'm assuming that whatever the length of this is, let's see what it is. So I'm guessing I have 1,311 different headers, but I'm guessing I actually have, it's going to be uneven, 656 locations. I'm unsure why I might have another no header there, unless this is my original. That could be the case. I might not have rerun this yet. So let's see what the length is now. And sure enough, that's even. So that's what I would expect to see. That makes me feel better. I'm like, okay, on track, getting the right idea here. And now X would slice that first one, and then the second one, the third one, and so on. But I actually want to be slicing the first and the second, then the third and the fourth, then the fifth and the sixth. So I'm going to be increasing this differently than X. So I probably want to create another variable here. Start at 1. So I'll slice out the first one. And then every time, instead of just increasing 1, I'm going to say y equals y plus 2, because I want to increase it doubling, or 2 at a time, sorry, not doubling. And my location is actually going to be, so whatever that value is, location row, is going to be whatever that first part of breakpoints is. So for instance, breakpoints, the first one, it should be 1, yes. So it's not on 1, that's my header, so I want to be +1, which is going to be right below. And then it looked like there was actually 2, so I mean +1 +2. So +1 will be part of my location data, and then +2 will be the other part of my location data. Another way I could do this, instead of doing these Y's counting as I'm going through and thinking about this, I'm thinking like, well, I could have done 1 and then put 2 and then put to the end of however many a part of breakpoints, because then that would do the same thing where it would just count like the first one and then the third and then the fifth and then the seventh, which is what I'm really doing with this y equals y plus 2. So whenever I'm writing any kind of code, creating a program like this, there's always a lot of different options. And so it's a good idea to just be thinking about, well, what other options could I have done? What's another approach I could have taken for this? It's helpful because then next time when you're approaching a different problem, you can think back to, okay, how did I approach it last time? And what were the things I came up with of ways I could have approached it? And what was fast about it? What was not good about it? And all that different kind of information. Alrighty, so row. So then and now I am going to use X. So I still have X counting in order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, blah, blah, blah. So I am going to actually use X at this point, and I'm going to slice out at X. I can do a cell array within a cell array, and then I can always get things out later. So I'm going to put together my data on this location row, comma, my data on the other location row. And then also I will need all my data. So my data is going to be from this point with y up to the next one. So, and not the very next one, because again, the very next one will be separating that header information. So the one at the top of the next header. So I will put I always like using copy paste when I can, because then I can avoid writing more stuff. And again, I don't want to be adding one to that, but rather than looking at that one, I want to be looking at the next one. Now, this will break and it will not work when I get to the end of the for loop, because at that point, I'll be on the last value of breakpoints and it's not going to work. So I want to make sure to say if x is equal to this value, I want to do something else. Otherwise, I'm going to do this. So then that's just going to be the end of my data set. So, all right, it is always a good idea to run a decent amount. So I am not going to add in the data at this point, but I do have this started to help me get the data parsed out. First, I just want to look and see, okay, am I getting these locations correct? So let's run it and watch what happens. And I'm getting my first error. So part of the problem of what I have here is this is a cell array, and this is another cell array. And then when I'm pairing these together, I'm getting a 1x2 cell array. So my intent was like, I was thinking, oh, I'll just have one cell, but that is correct. I do have a 1x2 cell array here. So one of the things I can do is do this to stack them. I do actually probably want these stacked. And also I can just put them in another cell. I don't want to take them out of the cell at this point because it's a bunch of text here. And if I just slice this out of the cell and then try to put it on top of more text sliced out of in a cell, most likely they're not going to all match up and be the same size. Could be, but most likely they're not going to. So I will just do it this way. This should be a 1x1 cell. No, let's put it as a 2x1 cell. Okay, so it's not going to like that. All right, so then I will just go keep it as a 1x2, and then I'm going to say x, 1 to 2. So I'm going to put it in 2 different columns and changing those rows. So I'm seeing already so far that on the left side, I'm liking what I see on the left side. This is the location that I'd be expecting. On the right side, I'm seeing a bunch of my header separations. So I don't love that. But then some of them, I do see data. The first one has data, the next ones do not. Okay. So that tells me when I look at my data. So this first one probably has a title here, and my other ones don't have titles on them most likely. So let's scroll down. Here's another one. So yes, sure enough, these ones have locations and they don't have a title, and only the first one had that title. So one thing I can do is I can just ignore that title there and then just say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. But that means I need to be careful of, like, if I delete it out of my data right here, I'm not going to have to worry about the problem of my data starting on a different row than all the other ones. That's probably the easiest approach to make sure that I just am like keeping it easy. It's an easy pattern again, so I can just delete that data out. Another approach could be if I wanted to say, all right, I'm going to keep that there, but then every single time I'm going to also look for this second point. So instead of just saying y, I would have to say where y. So like how I did y plus 2 here to look for that second point, I would have to say that's where I want to start for my data, in which I do have it set up this way. So we can go ahead and continue with that. That's, again, this is for the end though. Next row, okay, location row. And so I would have to do the same thing for the start of data. And it wouldn't be y plus 2, it would be y plus 1. Start of data, again, y plus 1. And that will still be okay for even this time. So both instances, like at the very end, because remember, I'm only doing every other one, like first, third, fifth, seventh, ninth. And so eventually when I get to the second to, or the last one that I'm looking at, there's still one more piece of data after. I just can't say y plus 2. I can't say y plus 1. Since it's the same thing inside my if statement, it's going to be the same no matter what the condition. I could also just put this row of code before my if statement or after my if statement, and then that way I don't have to repeat this line of code. So it eliminates one line of code, knowing that, again, it's the exact same thing no matter the condition for that particular if statement. And keeping this in mind, I'm going to go ahead and say, let's not do this second part. I'm only going to worry about that first piece of information for the location, and that means I don't need this anymore. When I'm deleting things, I can delete them or I can comment them out. A lot of times I like commenting them out just for the purpose of later if I want to be like, well, I have an idea. Why don't I grab that second row of information? Then I look at it and I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. I did that. And then I decided not to do that. So it's a good thing to just kind of remember. I could say, okay, if x is equal to 1, so it's my first time through, I want to go ahead and grab this piece of information because I know it's a header. It's information that is important to me. Or I could do that before the for loop because I only need to do it the one time. It's a one line of code. I don't need it to be in my for loop. So in fact, let's go ahead and do that because I might want that header at some point. So again, instead of calling it this, I'm just going to say all of that in one piece of information. This is the header for the data. And this, again, remember, is just a location. So I need to make sure to slice that out of that location out of my. So again, I will have a header now, and then I can get into the for loop. I have my location here, which I'm storing here, and these are my location names. So again, I can have all of these in a list. I will get myself into a little bit of trouble if I just try to add my data here, because again, this is saying row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And again, if it's not in a cell array, then if it's not a 1-by-1 cell array, it's not going to work in here. So another thing to remember is since I'm not grabbing this second column of information, I am no longer going to say 1 through 2. I only have 1, and then that's it, just that one column of information. So again, just for good practices, we'll run it again, see what it looks like now. So now I'm seeing all the location names showing up and happy with that. It looks good. And then I should also have my header at this point for the data stored here. So that looks good, which is again year, month, and then different rainfall data, I'm guessing is what all that's going to be. Oh, for each day. Okay, so 1st through the 31st. And keep in mind, there's not 31 days in every month, so that means my data is going to look different around the different months as well. So it's something to keep in mind thinking about what data I'm looking at soon. So again, I have my start of my data, my end of my data, and I want to make sure that this name is the same as this name. Otherwise, it's just going to use the most recent number that I had. It would cause an error. I don't want that. So my rainfall data for each location. We'll just start with the data slicing, look at it and think about how I want to store it. So again, from the start to the and just see what my data looks like. And I don't need to be looking at this again, so I'm going to suppress that for future ones. Okay, so here's an example of some of my data. All right, here we go. And again, it is parsed out a little bit weird. First thing we're going to notice is I accidentally grabbed the header one because I did not say +1 after I said +1. So I said +1 to the which one I was grabbing from breakpoints, so which row number, but I didn't add one to that row number. So it's still slicing all of those dashes. I don't want to include that in my data. So at this point, I'm going to have to do kind of the same process for all of this different data to parse out my years and my months and then all the data underneath. Um, again, it's a lot of where your data is stored, how your data is stored, and how you can download your data is going to make a world of a difference in analyzing your data. So this data set is a little bit trickier to get through the process of like actually getting to analyzing the data because we have to do all of this like playing around, moving it, thinking about what does my data actually look like and how can I use it. So keep going there. Again, I'll just run this so we can see that I did get rid of that header line. I see a couple popping up though. So I'm going to need to look at why that happened. I'm guessing I didn't do -1. Yep. So right here, I'm seeing this. I should have been subtracting 1 here. This one, I didn't have to do that because I'm just grabbing the last row of my data, which would be the same thing as writing n here. So I could have written n for the last one, but then that would mean I would need to write this in my if statement because that's what's changing. So that's, again, thinking about other approaches. Alrighty. And I don't see any of those dashes popping up, so that's good. Means I've cleared that out, took care of those problems. So I'm parsing out my data, but right now that data is not readily available because I'm not storing it anywhere. I want to go ahead and clean up that data a little bit before I start storing that data. And this I could do in a function if I wanted, so then I could put like another function here. That way I'm not getting a bunch of code starting to write into this plan because again, this is where I'm at right now. I don't have a super long code. A lot of these are just spaces. But it would start to get a little bit lengthy if I put all the information here of how to use this data. So I'm going to go ahead and move over here. Now I'm going to make the assumption. I cannot make the assumption that it's always going to be the same. Okay, we'll play around with this. We'll talk through our assumptions as we're playing around with this data and getting it parsed out. So the first two are always going to be the year and the month. That's fair assumption. I can do that. So that's the first place I want to start with this data. Again, I'm leaving off, I have this rainfall data that looks like this. I'm going to move over to another script file. I'm going to save this as, let's call it data parse rainfall data. And this is going to be a function eventually, so I will be adding function in and using parse rainfall data, but I'm not going to make it a function yet. So sometimes before I make my subfunctions functions, I decide to like just write all the code as is, not use CLC clear. That way all my data is readily available. I know that I'm going to be having rainfall data as the main data set I'm working with here. That's what I'm using. Rather than calling everything in here RF data, which would then anything I do to manipulate that will change it. I'm just going to say data equals RF data. So keep in mind, yes, that is going to overwrite the data that I have here in my workspace, but I'm not using that anymore anyway. I'm only really using data no header at this point. And once I turn this into a built-in function, or user-defined function, programmer-defined function is what I mean. So once I turn it into that, I don't have to worry about it affecting data at all. So again, all throughout here in this programmer-defined function, I'm going to be calling my data set just data. All right, so, and want to turn this more into either an array of data or a cell array. So one of the first things I want to think about in that decision is, do I have any nulls or missing data? And right here, I can see that I do have missing data. So if I have missing data, I can't put a 0 here, because if I put a 0 here, then it's assuming that there was no rain. But that's not the data I was given. I was given no data. So I want to record that no data, and I probably want to use empty brackets. But if I want to use empty brackets to signify missing or no data, well, I can't do that in a cell array. Or I'm sorry, I can do that in a cell array. I can't do that in matrix. I can't use double data type. So my best bet at this point is to really make a decision about how I want to approach this, and then thinking about what kind of calculations am I going to be doing. So I could put a -1 there, or like a -99, and then I just know -99 means missing data. But if I forget that I put that there, then when I go to look at -99s, or I do like an average and it's some huge negative number and I'm thinking, why? Well, oh yeah, I put -99 for missing data and I didn't take that out. So there's a lot of things and a lot of different factors that play in here that I need to think about. Okay. So one of the first things I want to think about doing is, okay, if I sell to Matt a cell array that has a bunch of different numbers, obviously these numbers aren't representative of what will actually be in my data, then what happens to the missing data? So this right here, we can see when I sell to Matt, it just disappears. So it's no longer there. The null, it ignores it. So the only way I would know that there was missing data if I just sell to Matt my cell array of data with empty brackets would be based on the number of data points, which that's probably enough piece information. Or I probably do want to say ignore any missing data and just average across how many days I have data for. That's probably what I'll end up doing. So I do kind of like the idea of just putting null or empty brackets anywhere that there was missing data. And again, if that's what I'm going to do, then I need to use a cell array. But if I can get all of this parsed out across different columns, that right there will help me a lot. The other thing is, again, when I have like February, I only have 28 days in February, or 29, depending on the year. So for February, I'm not going to have the 31 columns of rain data. I'm only going to have the 28. So again, I can use my null empty brackets in those cases for the days of the month that aren't happening. So that's, again, helps me think cell array is probably my best way to go. And I can always take a giant cell array and put it inside of a cell to make it a 1 by 1 if I need it to be like that in that case, depending on what I'm doing. All right. So since I'm going with a cell array, I'm going to just call it cell array data. The first thing I want to put here is I'm going to put what I'm putting inside of this data. So this is my title here. I'm going to say year, month, and then again, it's each one of the days. So I'm just going to be lazy about it. 1 to 31. I don't really feel like writing out 1 to 31 different numbers. So I'm just going to do num to cell and throw them all in cells. And I'm okay with them being numeric numbers instead of strings. I'm fine with that. It's for me to know what my data is. So I don't really care how it's formatted, or that fancy says like January, or like, oh no, it would just be day 1 anyway. So I don't really care if that's a string or a number. And again, I don't have to sit here and hand type in '1, '2, apostrophe, and blah, 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 blah. Although in the time I said this, I probably could have done. So whatever, here nor there. All right. So again, that's going to be my title, is right here where I'm getting started. Then I need to go through this data, and I'm going to have to row by row take every different data point and put it in a separate little column. I could see one thing I could do before I invest this much time is I could say, okay, I want to grab the last row of rainfall data, and I might like this. So I'll see And again, it depends on how I'm planning on using the data. Rainfall data, last row. So that's what it looks like. Yep, that matches up. If I just take that and I cell to mat it, let's see what my data looks like. Yeah, so it didn't like that. It just turned it into a giant string, which is kind of what I figured because again, it does have that string thing on there. I could see what happens if I string to double it. Not a number, so it doesn't like it because of all those spaces in there. That's kind of what I figured, but I just wanted to check because again, if there's an easier approach where I don't have to like go through each little point and say what it is, that would be ideal. But it looks like I'm going through the whole thing row by row. Again, in a for loop, so it's not like I'm actually going to be doing every single point. All right, so I want to go through this data starting at the first row all the way up to however many rows there are. Good practice to use size instead of length in case you have multiple columns and rows. In this case, I really only have multiple rows all in one giant column, hence this data problem. But for good practices and good reminder of length versus size, I will use size. All right. So the first thing I have here, and then the first part I'm going to be slicing is again that row. So row data is going to be data. And I do want to slice out the data. So I want to slice it out of the cell array. And the way I'm doing that is using those braces to say slice out. And all right, so then we're here, we're slicing out the data. So again, first thing I want to do is in the first column of cell array data is going to be my year. And the second one is going to be my month. And so here, when I have this sliced out, I am going to just use this and we're going to go ahead and use the end since we've already been looking at it, even though it looks like it's mostly zeros. So the first thing I want to take out is going to be the first 4 all the time. Now the month is going to always be 2. That's convenient. That's nice that they put in 01, 02, 03. It makes it a little bit easier because then I can just hard code it. I could say isspace and look for it and get fancy, but if my first chunk of like first 8 like columns, first 8 columns of that text really are consistent and the same, actually 7, sorry, first 7 are the same all the time, I'm just going to hard code it. This isn't meant to be for any other data set. It's really just for this one. And I'm guessing if I'm downloading more of this data, it's going to download the same. So I'm going to make the same assumptions. Again, I'm communicating my assumptions. A lot of times it's helpful to write those in if you're going to make an assumption like I am now in hard coding. So cell array data equals cell array data. Not, well, I will get there eventually. So we're going to go ahead and just, again, thinking ahead, I'm going to be throwing in another cell array below, and I'm going to call that cell array new because it makes sense to me. And that's going to be one of the last things on my board. So this cell array new is going to have to be first, again, my year, which is going to be this row of data. I'm going to string to double because at this point I do want to change everything to numbers. So I'm going to string to double that first part of row of data. So 1 through 4. And yep. And I do want to put it in a cell. Yep. Don't want to put a cell within a cell at this point. So I also want to have after that is going to be the same kind of concept. But instead of 1 through 4, I'm going to skip a space and then do 5 and 6. Sorry, skip 5, do 6 and 7. So again, that's my set one, easy, always the same size. Think I defined row of data. Yes, I did. So I can go ahead and test that. Oh, it does not like that I didn't close the bracket. So yeah. So I see here 2020 and 12. So that's good. I have my first part, my year, my months, and then I'm getting into the number part of my data, the actual rainfall. All right. Now my number of spaces are different at this point. Row of data, I'm going to go ahead and delete out those first 7 rows because again, I don't need those anymore. I have that data. I don't want to collect that again and confuse myself. And I just want to look at the one here to get an idea. So everything I have, again, separating here is a bunch of spaces. So it'll be similar to before when I was looking for those dashes. Now I'm just looking for spaces, but I do have the function is space to find all the spaces. So again, after I do this, I'm going to say row of data 1 through 7, delete it because again, I am done using it. Alrighty, getting a little bit closer. And just think we're not even into any analysis yet. All we're doing is parsing out our data at this point. So yes, this is really how it happens sometimes. Especially the trickier the data set, the weirder it's stored. It is what it is. And I don't know if you sent me it this way or if it's just downloading this way, but I figure it's a good example of how to parse out data more because I have had problems like this that can be a little bit of a pain sometimes to get through. So it's helpful to know how to, again, access your data regardless of how it's been provided or how you can get it. Then you can actually make it accessible for using. Yes, you can manually do this kind of stuff, but I find having a computer do it for you normally saves you a lot of time. And again, if you're re-downloading that data, I don't have to go through the same process for this type of data or this specific data set ever again, because I would just rerun this code and call it a different data set right at the beginning. When I call the data here, just call a different file and we're good to go, you know? And I can even use this for similar types of data by just changing things. Like this might change or something else changes, but I can just slightly modify this versus doing it from scratch. So yes, it takes a little longer sometimes, depending on your proficiency of grabbing, copying, pasting, moving all of that, or writing a program to do it for you. But in the long run, I think that this is always the way to go. Plus, it's good practice, so why not? All right. So we are looking for spaces. Is space row of data. So then I'm looking for the spaces here. This is space locations. Mhm. True, 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 false. So then I want to say everywhere that there's the falses, this is the number I want to grab, that's the number I want to grab, that's the number I want to grab. So anywhere I have like not a space, I want to be grabbing those areas. So I can do the same thing again, where instead I have row numbers to work with, just to use kind of the same process we already did. Or, all right, just for showing you. If I do row of data and then I'm going to say slice out space locations, this will actually just grab all my numbers. Nothing. Oh, I'm sorry. So yeah, because I grabbed all the spaces. Makes sense. So if I were to say not space locations, opposite, grab all the numbers. So here I see all the numbers in a row. Um, the problem is, yes, in this instance, they're all zeros. So it'd be pretty easy. It's just 0 on all of them. But the problem is I can't tell where or like when this is happening. So I can't tell this is day 1, this is day 2. In this case, I kind of can. I mean, like it's all zeros. I can assume that, sure. But if I had row data, let's go and minus 5. Just picking. There we go. Here's a good one. So if I have this as my data, the row of data, and I go ahead and say delete out the month and year, so then my row of data is going to look like this. So I have all these numbers here, and I do that same thing we just did, the space locations, and again, row of data, not space locations. I grab all the numbers. Here's an example. I have no idea where my decimal ends. I have no idea where my new number begins. I can't just slice out like that because I can't work with this data. So again, that's why I would rather go the approach of find and again, telling me which rows are where these spaces are occurring. All right. Or I could do the opposite and say row and then not spaces. Let's go ahead and do that one. Why not? So not spaces. So then it tells me 5, 6, 7. So I know 5, 6, 7, that's my first number. Now there's a gap, and 8, 9 is nothing. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 is my next number that I want. So anything that goes in a row is my number that I'm grabbing. All right. So keep going. And so again, that's going to be where all these numbers are going, but I don't want to num. I don't want to throw them onto my cell array just yet because I'm just going to do the num to cell thing. Once I have a matrix of data, I'll probably throw it in there. Um, and then I have to make sure to get my blanks. I'm going to stick with the space one just because okay, so one thing I'm going to have to keep in mind is if the number of, I'm going to use spaces because I have to keep in mind if the number of spaces is greater than 2, 3, 4, 5, 1. I would say greater than 6 means I probably am skipping a data point. So let's see how big this is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 6. So it's like 8 or more. So I'll have to keep in mind those empty points again. All right. Now, if I wasn't concerned about which day these occurred on, like just when it happened in the month, then I could just take all the numbers and only worry about the numbers and not worry about when there's missing data. I'm not super concerned about which day has missing data or if missing data happens, I think what I'm more so concerned about is just the numbers of that rainfall data. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab the numbers and then just put empty spaces at the end and kind of ignore when that missing data happens. I'll just know like if there was 28 or 29 in February, like I'm probably spot on. I could be missing one. If it was a 29 month and I don't take that into consideration, but oh well. If there's only 29 points of data in April, like I know I'm missing data. So I'm just going to go with that assumption and again, not be concerned about which day did I miss data on. Now, if I had to look at something where I was concerned about how the days went in order for my calculations, then it would be important to make sure that that missing data lines up with what day it was missing on. Because if the probability is changing across each day and I'm trying to calculate that, well, if I just assumed that the missing data wasn't there and I moved it to the end of the month and just said it was missing at some point, well, now I've kind of screwed up that calculation. So since I'm making that assumption, I am not going to worry about those spaces. And I'm just going to say number of locations. So I'll change that name, number of locations, and then I want to go from wow. All right, so I'm going to go through and I'm going to be deleting out my numbers locations as I'm going through and putting them, collecting those numbers. So first, I want to slice out the first one. I want to make sure not to use X because I already used that X on my for loop and I don't want to just be changing that number around. Not a good idea. If I'm doing a running total, don't want my running total number this or variable the same as my control variable for my for loop. So y equals 1. And then sometimes I like those recommendations that they have on MATLAB now with this update. Sometimes they drive me a little nuts. So if okay, as long as this is equal to, I'm gonna do that here, So first I'm going to say that start number. So that's going to be like, for instance, I'd be grabbing 5. So then I would say 5, and then it would say, okay, y equals y plus 1. So then and then my number is going to equal my start num in the beginning. So then if I add 1 to that, is that equal to the next location? Which in this case it is. So it's 6. 6 equals 6. So then it would say, okay, true. So as long as that's true, then I want to keep adding y. Once that's false, my end num is going to equal my number locations y minus 1. Let me think about this. That's changing. This needs to be changing also. Okay, so this would be number locations y minus 1 plus 1. That's not creating another variable that I don't need. So that's better. All right, so again, I do have number locations. No. So I called it space locations before. So I'm going to now call it number locations. And then I want to say, okay, y equals 1. And remember, I need to string to double that data because it isn't a string. So I'm going to test this out, just see where I'm at. I might have some changes I need to fix. For instance, starting out with making this empty to begin with. Okay, so it's liking it in the beginning. Let me look at my row of data again, because I'm guessing I went too far to the end. So 0 is my last point. So my last one is 4.6 and 0, 0, 0, 0. So here, let's see what my start num is on that, 216. And then let's see what my length of number locations. No, length of row of data is 217. So then, okay, and I bet you y is equal, right now, y is probably going to be equal to my number of, or greater than my number of locations. Right, greater than my length. This, okay. And then I want to say, here's one I can do different than nnum. So I can say that's nnum if y is equal to the length, then I want to do this approach, else this. And so instead of nnum, I would just say n. All right, so let's see where we're at if I do this instead. So again, remember number of locations. So this I'm going to say while y is less than number of locations. And then I can say after this, y equals y plus 1 to kick it out. Let's see what that looks like. Cool. So it did run, it completed it. So then I'm getting those different locations. So then I can say, okay, take this, again, do that num to cell, suppressing everything I didn't suppress before because I don't need to see it again. I already did my testing with it. I'm happy with it. So suppressing. Alrighty. And I think I was calling that cell array new. So then my cell array new is going to equal my cell array new, comma, num to cell, this. And now keep in mind again, this is not going to be equal to the full 1 by 63. So 1 by 63 does not Makes sense. 1 by 61. Why am I 1 by 61? It's either repeating it twice or I ran it. Oh, because I didn't erase it, maybe? So we can go ahead and just test this, just this part. Oh, 30. Okay, so then this one's good, 30. Okay, so I'm not as concerned. I don't know why it was that way, but it was. Um, and make sure I don't have anything weird here. Nope, num to solve here. Good. And then so 33 columns. So if I have less than 33 columns, then I want to keep adding a column with, again, just that missing empty data point. And that's to make it even out. So then this is good. Doesn't like something here. So I'm guessing I did some while n, if n, while n, for n. So just checking I didn't end something. So I have while n, if else n, while n, while n. Oh, because I have this here. All right, so let's go ahead and run it. It doesn't like this part, so accelerate data is going to be, I want this to be up here, so then switch it up a little. So I've created that idle cell. And there's clearly a lot of data here, and again, this is just for one location, so glad I'm not doing that by hand. Alrighty, so if I look at accelerate data, I do have my 33 columns and I have all these different years of data all here. So then now that I know that this works, I can finish off my function. So, rainfall data updated equals parse rainfall data. And since I already named the script file, I need to make sure I give my function the same name, just as a reminder about programming functions. And again, remember, I just called everything data in here, so I want to call it data here. And ideally, if I was planning ahead, I'd be putting some type of documentation here, not there, here, documentation. I'm not going to do that right now, but I'm just saying, ideally I should. Good practices. I don't always practice best practices, but I try to at least remember what they are and be mindful of when I'm not doing them. All right. And reminder, that's what I called my outgoing data. So then my program defined function is saved. I can come in here and I call that. And again, this is what the input was that I was planning on. Then the output is really this data updated, which is what I'm going to call here. So again, now I have my location is stored in this location. So I'm going to say, just to the purpose of putting the data here, I'm going to say, okay, so let's say we have that first column is the name. I'm going to say inside the second column is going to be all that data just to put it there. For now, again, this is just getting that data organized. So then I can analyze. All right, so then this is my update. I'm going to suppress all of these because I don't need to watch that program define function. I'm assuming that it's going to be good. So now I see this running. And so does not like. So right here, I'm seeing that inside of my programmer defined function, I did get an error. It did not like something for line 25. Here, it did not like something at one point for this. Maybe I want to put this first. If I put this condition first, just in case I'm saying y minus 1 plus 1, and that's not, that shouldn't be causing an error. Okay, I can foresee potentially where there could be a problem there. So I'm going to swap that around, put that condition first. So first is checking to make sure, hey, y is less than the length of number of locations, right? And if it's not even going to run. If it's equal to, so that means it's the last one, I'm just going to be grabbing the last one anyway, so I don't need to be doing it. Okay. So talking through it, running again. Let's see if we get the same error if that happens. It's running a little bit longer, I feel like, so that tells me I might not have that same error. I think I fixed that. That's a good thing. So again, I'm seeing all of my different rainfall data on the right side. Left side is my location names. I at least have more accessible data now. I can get into analyzing this more. Again, this is a lot of data. So I'm going to stop here for today and at least just get to this point. And again, now that we have accessible data, we'll get into analyzing it next. I guess you can hang out with me until this is done going through all the data so we can see that it really does truly work and we don't have another error like we had before. Don't think it's helpful. So I don't really know when it will stop going. So there we go. Okay. So now we've gone through all the data, no errors, all my data is accessible. Next up, I can analyze it. But again, I'm going to stop here for today. So thanks for hanging out. And again, thank you for this problem. And I'm glad we can go through and sort this data out. I will get this code posted later after I do the analysis, but I'm going to go ahead and send this over to the subscriber who commented. So thank you so much. See you all. Bye.